Now, my pleasure to get us started on the 11th panel, I guess, of our 12 panels, which is in this corner, the data center versus the broadcast center. And it's going to be led by my good friend Paul Scardino, Vice President of Sales and Marketing of Globecomm Systems. Paul?
Thank you, Robert. Thanks, everybody, for showing up today. You got to forgive me if my voice cuts in and out because I guess the dry weather and the cold that I've had is getting to me. So if I sound like I'm from the mafia, it's probably because I am. Anyway, as Robert said, I'm Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Globecomm Systems in New York. And I realize a lot of you probably saw the title of what this panel is going to be about, and you said, great, I'm in Vegas, and I'm finally getting to see a fight. Well, it's not a fight, but we tried to make it that way to make it interesting. Actually, the colleagues we have today, we're going to be here talking about IP convergence and tying in the broadcast centers with the data centers so it becomes really one item. Our colleagues on the panel have a wide range of expertise, if you will. Starting on my far right, Ovadia Cohen. Ovadia is Director of Network Ovadia is Senior Director of Business Development at Harmonics, and we bring him on as a legacy type broadcast product engineer. Next to Ovadia, O'Brien McKinley. O'Brien is Director of Network Operations from PBS. So from an operations point of view, O'Brien's seen broadcast centers turn into data centers in his whole career. Next is technical expert in the field of satellite communications and broadcast technology, Mr. Sidney Shea of Shea Telecom. And finally, of course, because Cisco is sponsoring this, we had to have a Cisco panelist. George Tupi is really a networking expert, so he brings the data side of the expertise in. So it rounds out the entire panel. And with that, I'd like to go to each one of the panelists to have a brief bio about themselves. Why don't we start with Ovadia?
So my background is basically in compression. I was many years with Scopus, one of the co-founders of Scopus Video Networks. We were just acquired by Harmonic last month. Our background was in compression, video delivery systems, encoding, decoding. A lot of, I would say, most of the business was in satellite domain, and lately, of course, in IP. Then now I'm part of the Harmonic team. Thank you.
Thank you, Ovadia. Next, O'Brien McKinley. O'Brien has a camera up there, you'll notice, so we're being filmed, but he's taking snapshots of all of you. You might find yourself on YouTube.
Digital stills, so there is some convergence there. Thanks, Paul. Again, I oversee the broadcast operations for PBS, Public Broadcasting, out of Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. Prior to that, I worked at Turner Broadcasting and Turner Studios. Before that, I was with CNN, and then before that, did operational management with Opryland Productions, the Nashville Network, and CBS. So I've seen just about every type of production, master control, tape roll, or IP roll that you can imagine.
Thank you, O'Brien. And next, Sidney Shea.
Yeah, I'm Sidney Shea. The name is pronounced Shea, like Shea Stadium, although it's spelled S-K-J-E-I. It's a Norwegian name. I'm with Shea Telecom. We're an independent satellite and broadcast engineering consulting firm located in the Washington, D.C. area. We've been in business since 1994. We're about 11 engineers, and we're about 85% commercial, 15% government, and we've had over 100 different customers that range everywhere from large broadcast networks and government agencies down to independent small television stations and just people who need link budgets sometimes. Normally we'll work for end users as opposed to service providers, but we work for everyone. So
Thank you, Sydney. And next, George Tupi from Cisco.
Hi. My first exposure, I'm going to maybe date myself in the media space, was MPEG-2 over ATM. After we tried to fight that battle, instead of fighting, we decided to join the IP revolution. So be part of the SP marketing for Cisco for the last couple of years, and we going to work on the whole IPification of the end-to-end, from the content ingestion all the way to home, all the way to IP experience. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And as for myself, as I said, Vice President of Sales and Marketing, it usually has people taken aback because they say this guy's full of it. Whatever he says is going to be lying. But my background is engineering, satellite communications engineering, and I just wanted to give a quick briefing of GSI, only because I don't want to make it a sales pitch, but I want to show you people how we've gone through the history of a broadcast center and turned it into a data center. GSI started off strictly satellite-centric. We used to build earth stations and networks, and we got more and more into the back office equipment. And then we began our own services business. So if any of you look on the GSI website, you'll see the teleports that we have. We have Showtime operating out of our facility. And the business, as it began to grow, we noticed it had to go more IP-centric. And really, that's a perfect segue into our discussion today. We've dealt with voice over IP, we've dealt with broadcast systems, and exactly that, we've become a data center at Globecomm for our services operations. So with that in mind, I'd like to throw out the first item, and I'll bring up Sydney for the first question, and then the other gentleman will interrupt or intercede, if you will, and I'd like to have some inputs from the audience. If you have any questions, certainly raise your hand during the middle of the conversation and add into the conversation, and we'll have questions at the end as well. But the first question is, how is the broadcast center actually changing due to the convergence of content onto IP? Why don't we start with Sydney?
Thanks, Paul. Well, of course, it's changing in a lot of ways, everywhere from fewer people to more use of embedded audio. Generally speaking, what I see is that a lot of the functions people used to do are being taken over by computers, and that the storage systems are becoming more complicated and more involved than before. The need to produce broadcasting, not only for over-the-air broadcasting but also web broadcasting, requires that a computer be involved in automation and in switching, whereas before you might have special units to do that. So that, I would say, that's the biggest change that I see.
Very good. Anybody else want to add to that?
Oh, sure. The biggest thing, obviously, from a master control facility is every instrument or every device that we touch now has a Cat5 cable connected to it. What does that mean for the master control operator, the management of master control, or network operation facilities? I have more efficiency to better see what's going on behind the scenes, as well as from an accountability standpoint of is going on when somebody touches a button. So that brings more efficiency within my operations, as well as I relate to the Lexus brand or a GM brand, where if there's a problem with the vehicle or an upcoming service maintenance, you'll get an email or a phone call saying, you've got to check me. The same thing happens within my facility. We'll get emails even beforehand when we see that there's a delta between some of the efficiencies that we've set as parameters, as well as in an emergency operations, we quickly know when we're trying to do some protective measures or backup measures that we're about ready or have already had a failure. So a lot more efficiencies can be realized from the days of tape.
Very good, very good.
Yeah, from the Cisco's perspective, what we saw and the difficulties what we had to overcome was, from the Cisco's perspective, the difficulties we had to overcome was you basically had two different completely independent organizations, right? I mean, your IP geeks and your creative people. And talking to, I mean, one of the major U.S. corporations, what they had to do basically, forget the names, okay? We're going to completely dissolve the organization. You're not going to be IT, you're not going to be creative. It's going to be one organization, come up with a new name. They call it the digital media. So technical side, in my opinion, is almost the easier problem to solve. It was all the human cost. I mean, getting people to understand. I mean, you're part of this one organization. IP is part of the creative process. Is not only for the IT. And if you want to have we have kind of case studies on Cisco.com. One from DR, from Denmark, and the second one is what we're using as kind of the value of IP contribution was NBC Olympics. We did kind of the ingest in Beijing, and all the editing was done in New York. So it was first time we kind of proved, I mean, IP is good enough, even good enough for the Olympics for IP contribution, where you have only 17 days to recoup a significant amount of money.
Okay. I would add on the head-end side, I think something which really dramatically happened in the last, I would say, 10 years. If 10 years away we saw broadcast centers or digital video head-ends used to have a lot of cables and matrices and connectivity which was ASI-based and SDI-based. Nowadays you can see more and more equipment which is fully IP, and if you used to have a system with X numbers of channels located in one location, providing, for example, statistical multiplexing system, now you can have the same system in different locations, so content can be delivered from one place to another, still have the advantage of having a StatMax system into a specific transponder. So it was a huge, let's say, development from that perspective. So IP brought to the broadcast center the flexibility and the innovation of having different encoding system in different places that can contribute into a single point. On top of it, we used to see a lot of equipment coming as pure satellite or pure cable. Now you can see more and more IP working in parallel to the satellite, so you can use IP much more redundant-wise and efficiency-wise. So definitely a huge, I would say, development on that side from data-centric way. I mean, from the classical transmission way to the data way of working.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. IP interfacing certainly makes things more flexible for all of us. What I've seen in my career, and many of the people at GSI, even up to the CEO who started out as satellite engineers, is that the skills of the people had to change. Really, as the company grew, we began to learn more and more about IP networking and whatnot. But Sydney, what kind of change have you seen in the engineers that you require working for you?
Well, the broadcast center still needs RF engineers and still needs audio engineers. But now we need to integrate software people more into the broadcast centers, because there's a whole new raft of problems that could happen that couldn't happen before. Before, if you had a tape, you might misplace it, but it would always be there. Today, if you have a file and you delete it, then you've got nowhere to go to get it to get on the air. So you need people who are computer savvy, who can mine the systems and see when problems are coming. Typical problems that occur, like overflow. If you don't delete the files when they're supposed to be, your automation system can fill your servers up, and you've got nowhere to put people. So you need software people who are good at bookkeeping and understand the file structure of the systems that you're working with.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the thing that I've found also is that if someone is an IP network guy, unlike George, who understands in both ends of the spectrum, it's difficult to bring that IP network guy into the RF world, I mean, O'Brien, you certainly have seen it in your operations, correct?
No, absolutely. I remember attending NAB around 10 years ago when that word convergence came around. How many have been here since then and remember the theme for NAB that year? Right. I think actually right now we're realizing that convergence is a part of what we're actually facing with. It's a hard time for me to hire RF engineers. They are almost non-existent, which is sad because we still have to rely on uplink technology, and satellites to get our broadcast out. But even that added layer that we're working with, PBS is coming from a real-time delivery of broadcast imagery, if you will, across 7 channels to a non-real-time file over satellite delivery here in the next couple years. So the technology, as it relates, are converging tremendously, and to find that person that has skill sets, both from an IT perspective as well as a broadcast perspective, is hard to find. The average tenure of my team is 15 plus years. Yes, they were around when 2-inch was rolled. I was there as well. And I'm curious, does anybody have any quad decks on their floor anymore? Let me ask as a poll real quickly, who in the audience here has master control facilities that they manage or operate in? Anybody? Are you an engineer base primarily? Show of hands. Okay. So from the master control perspective, trying to find somebody with that skill set is extremely difficult, only because of where we're moving into that non-real-time file delivery system. As a matter of fact, in my control center right now, I would say 98% of anything that we do is file-based, and having to move within that architecture can be difficult. And as what Sid said earlier, if you delete that file and it's not on the archive, then we have a big problem. So not only do you have to understand the mechanics and architecture of that infrastructure, but also the broadcasting mechanics of that as well.
Very good. Go ahead, Ovadia.
From the customers and the service providers' point of view, I think, as you said before, Brian, it's something that really amazing. A few years ago, when we went to customers explaining how the new technology with IP-based and what's the flexibility and advantage is providing, nobody in those operations had IT guys to help them to build the system and to build the infrastructure. So at the beginning, I would say it was very difficult to convince satellite operators, cable operators that IP is part of their system. Usually, typical answer was, okay, we need the IT guys. Nowadays, it's totally different. IT is part of the team. So that's, I would say, one of the major changes from that perspective.
Yeah, what
I
we
guess
see.
you are happy with that, Jones, no?
Well, no. I will probably reinforce your point, because what we're hearing from the broadcasters is, you can get excellent IP engineers, you can get excellent video engineers, but what they are completely missing is that system level buzzword, but still system level. Is there somebody who can address both intelligently IP side and the video side at the same time, instead of having 2 different teams, 2 different people solving it? So we see the same thing.
Yeah, certainly we're seeing actually the convergence of skills as well as the convergence of the technical aspect of the broadcast centers. From my point of view, in Globecomm, we had the same thing that Ovadia is talking about. We had an IP networking group, but those guys have converged and learned about RF, and vice versa. The RF guys have learned about IP infrastructure and IP design. Ultimately, our goal is to create a complex network or a complex project, and it invariably includes an IP infrastructure. So Cisco's good friends with us. One of the poster child for IPTV, if you will, is IP Prime, and IP Prime, as most of you know from SES Americom has failed. They went bankrupt and they're out of business now. Everyone always thought that was a great idea, and I throw it out to the gentleman why they feel it failed. I mean, one of the main reasons that I thought it might have failed was it was something that was there before its time. And anybody any comments or additions to that or whatnot? Take it.
Well, I don't work for SES Americom and didn't work on them, so I'll qualify to say that it's really only my impression. But I think IP Prime was aimed at the second level of telephone companies. If you were a really big telephone company, you could have your own broadcast center, like Verizon does, for example. But if you were a second level telephone company, you couldn't afford to have your own broadcast center, so you needed someone to provide you the programming and the rights and to distribute it to. And I think those were probably the customers that were targeted. And I think basically what happened was that those type of customers didn't take up on the program as fast as they wanted to. They had hoped to sell more to the second echelon, if you will, of telcos, and they just they were, as you say, before their prime, and the sales just didn't happen, so the service was canceled.
Again, as the consumer, yes, we use SES Americom. We have several transponders within their fleet. But looking at it from the consumer level, it was one of those far-fetched ideas that was baked and fully vetted, but still yet ahead of its time. So I'll have to just echo a comment. Similarly, I was on a project in Turner Broadcasting called the Aircraft Channel, or Private Networks, Airport Network, as you see in any major hub now. We also did the Checkout Channel. It checked out. We also did Cafe USA, which was food court TV. We also did this little venture in back of taxi cabs many years ago. Never flew, didn't work, would never happen. And also elevator television. Pick your adjective for that. So again, in those same parallels, that stuff was way ahead of its time. How many cabs in New York do you get into now? Not only do you get to see where you're going, but you're inundated with product advertisements time in and time out. And if you want to buy a ticket online, here's swipe your card here. So it was one of those fully baked ideas, and a great idea. I just don't think the market and us as consumers were ready to actually venture into something that could have been very good, even way back then.
Yeah, the IP Prime was developed actually by Globecomm Systems, so they were a customer of ours, and when they brought it up to us, that we thought it was an excellent idea. From what I learned in investigating it further, they really paid for the full gamut of what they wanted to do, say 5 and 10 years into the future. So their expenses were immense, and really the customer base that they wanted, as Sydney was suggesting, tier 2, tier 3 operators weren't buying into them quick enough, and it almost seemed like their business plan was a little incorrect. And obviously we know what happened from there. It failed because they weren't getting enough revenue to pay for their expenses. Any other comments that you'd like to add on to that? Ovadia, you're okay?
No, I'm okay, although the philosophy of IP Prime is something that in the satellite and the cable business already did it with what they call a head and in the sky type model. Right. And as you say, the business model behind it was not good enough, didn't generate enough revenues. And probably the DBS by itself killed it with enough offerings. So
absolutely.
That's what happened, yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. Definitely a good point. So I guess the next point I would like to ask of all of you is from a business perspective, and O'Brien probably would be the first one to talk about this. From a business perspective, changing from an RF world to an IP infrastructure, what is the business outlook? Does it look like the company ends up saving money? Does it look more productive? Certainly monitoring is a big plus. But what else do you have besides that?
Protect your assets and your investments. Everybody knows what the economy is like now. We've already made plans to continue with, the efficiencies that we're trying to move forward with. As well, in parallel with that, what platforms are our programs going to be actually broadcast to? I'm looking here and see the Mobile DT Pavilion. That's another venture in mobile handheld that we're playing a prime part. So it's all of these technologies that are starting to emerge. Some, just like in the works that I was working in at Turner, some will work, some are ahead of their time. But the bottom line, it's a new way to distribute your assets. It's an additional way to protect your assets more efficient from the user side. I'm not, and when I say make more efficient, let me say that it's more reliable. It's not, in some cases, going to be a reduction in your workforce. You still have to have, as I do in my team, I still have to have persons there to do their position, to do that job. There has to be a person there. I don't care what anybody says. It's about making said products more efficient for a reliable broadcast. Because if you see on any prime evening, prime time, on a PBS member station, they are probably taking that feed from me. And if there's a problem with that feed, then I get the phone call. So I guess in essence that means I don't get as many phone calls because there's not as many problems, and we're making said paths, streams more efficient. Therefore, the end consumer can realize a better feel, a better look, and know that that programming will get to them, 24/7, 365. Not to coin a phrase, but in a more efficient and reliable manner.
So it becomes a large infrastructure and capital asset change. Sidney, George, Ovadia, have you seen a lot of customers making a complete overhaul of their systems, or is it gradual?
It definitely it is a gradual approach. I don't think it's happened in one day or in one time. It's a gradual approach. I think we at Harmonic started with the IP approach. I think even 8 years ago already. Everything in the system at the very beginning was in parallel. That means whether it was an ASI, SDI, or whether it's a satellite or cable, it was in parallel with the IP. Even nowadays, still we are running all the equipment and all the infrastructure running in parallel, the classical RF or ASI or whatever is needed there in parallel to the IP. But on the other hand, you can see more and more operations that are moving fully moving to IP. So the infrastructure will be basically only data infrastructure instead of the classical broadcast infrastructure. So it's not going to happen in one day, but you can see it. It's all over. It's IP still in parallel with the current, with the old or the current broadcast. But as long as we are moving ahead, you can see it more and more data-centric.
And how big of a change, George, would this have on this typical broadcast center?
Well, I mean, broadcast center, in our opinion, is kind of the other side of the same equation, right? I mean, you start with content consumption and monetizing that consumption. If you want to monetize content over end screens, you have to produce it in IP. Otherwise, lives get very difficult. Example, once again, the Olympics. I mean, they used to have around 1,200 primetime TV-only content. They went from 1,200 to 3,600, and the whole delta, 2,000 plus hours, was thanks to IP. Because, I mean, once they moved to IP, now they ingested all 40 plus venues. Before it was only kind of your primetime, your swimming, your track and field. Now everything was in IP. Also, there is only so much time you can physically sit in couch and consume content. Once it was on IP, not only you can watch it when you want it, they monetize it 3 times. First time on the TV, then there was the what they call the highlights factory. If you want the highlights, you paid on the highlights factory. And the third one was NBCOlympics.com. So third time you stream the content. So we definitely see it as part of the same equation. And probably I'm biased because we work with only probably broadcasters who decided to move to IP. But usually we see, the whole movement to the IP. The entire broadcast center is changed to be IP-centric.
Really? Okay. Sydney, how about you and your customers? What have you seen happen?
Well, you'll hear a lot of vendors tell you that the IP-based broadcast center is much simpler than the old broadcast centers, and there's some truth in that. For example, before you'd had a router and a switcher and branding, and these were all separate equipments, and these were all controlled by their own automation systems, or they had a person controlling them. And today you'll generally see one piece of equipment which will do all three functions, and it's hooked up to the automation system. But on the other hand, the broadcast centers have gotten more complicated in the storage area. Before you had tape decks and a shelf, right? And tape would come in, and you'd dub it, make a copy, and you'd put it on the play shelf, and then pull it out and play it to air at the time. Today you've got an air server, you've got an archive, you've got a network associated storage, you've got a content management system to move between all of these places, and you've got, as I mentioned before, you've got to watch it pretty closely, because if you start overloading any of these, you can get into trouble really fast. So the actual automation and play out has become simpler, but the storage has become a lot more complicated.
Thank you. And beyond the capital, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Excuse me, Paul. Not an engineer, but a content provider, if you will. But on the engineering side, are you having a problem cross-training your engineers over to the IP area? And do you see an environmental value or a green value, O'Brien, to the conversion? Are we increasing speed, pushing data through faster, reducing a heat or a consumption of electricity?
We are, excuse me, real quick, that was two parts. I got the latter part. The first part, I'm sorry?
Is there a cross-training issue?
Okay, thank you.
For your staff? You're bringing the IT guys into the department.
Yes. We're seeing, not necessarily for the back of the box, coming from the master control supervisor, they have to be aware of signal flows, signal path workflows, and how that layer is strategically layered up on the IP infrastructure. We receive files from an archive at another location at our media operations center, through several OC3s. So it goes from one MAM to another via an overlay. And then our automation system then pulls it off as it's needed for air, sometimes 24, 48 hours, 72 before air. But specifically to your question, yes, we do have an engineering staff that has to be cross-trained to have that additional layer, so they're able to not only mitigate, they're also able to diagnose what's wrong when they do see, when your BlackBerry or your pager goes off and you've got 100 alarms, but you're still on the air. So they have to literally be able to drill down at the sub-menu level to figure out what's going on. As far to your second part, are we seeing more of a green inducive technology environment? In my master control facility and the equipment core, we are right now moving from one operational workflow, if you will, to our new HD environment. We've just increased our capacity from multiple SDs and one HD to 3 and now ultimately 4 HDs and an SD component. So within that, we're seeing some efficiencies, but with the said infrastructure for the network side as well as the satellite side, we haven't seen that reduction in use, only because we just got in Northern Virginia, our local power company decided to hit us with a 50% increase in to them. So, yeah, so we're because of just the environment and that constant cooling factor, we are now rebuilding some infrastructure to support the new environment, and we are hopeful at that point we will see through our HVAC system we'll see some efficiencies, thereby decreasing our power. But I can tell you we do have generators on site, and we do load share. So we will go off the commercial grid, and that power company will pay us to stay off the grid. And they pay us, but because of the cost of fuel nowadays, it's basically paying for the fuel. Yeah, it's just a net zero.
Thank you, O'Brien. Now, besides that operational cost, and I'll ask this to my equipment manufacturers, isn't it true that once I embed video onto an IP stream and talking about going over satellite, once it's encapsulated into an IP stream, now aren't I using more bandwidth? So my operational cost of the satellite bandwidth, doesn't that increase?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, you're going to get some overhead, but usually you're getting advantages with IP encapsulation what you didn't have before. So, I mean, if you're monetizing at the end of the day, I mean, you make more money if you spend a little bit more. So at the end of the day, you're making money.
Yeah, I think I looked at this one time, and I think the numbers are between 4% and 15% additional overhead, depending upon how many MPEG transport stream packets you put into a typical IP packet. If you only put one MPEG packet into an IP packet, you're going to have a 15% overhead. But if you're able to put the maximum, which I think is 7, you can knock that number down to 4%, which is pretty reasonable.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And on top of it, the technology is moving so fast forward in terms of, moving really forward in terms of efficiency. So overall, it's something that definitely can be absorbed by the system. And the new techniques for encoding, moving from MPEG-2 to MPEG-4, for example, and new techniques for video processing makes this life much more easier. So that 4 to 7 or 8 depends on the architecture percent. Is not that that's problematic.
Talking about efficiencies, let's think of it from the end standpoint. You can have that same bandwidth, so you're limited to X files over X period of time. But then if you're near to air, wouldn't it make sense from an operational standpoint to equate those efficiencies, to have the presenter or producer to present that to your distribution center earlier? So your model stays the same, your efficiencies are built in, but you're pushing that upstream, and then also having late fee charges, saying, look, if you can't get it here at this time, then the pipe won't be available because it's full. Whether you're stat muxing or whatever, it's full. So just pushing that upstream to equate those efficiencies into that workflow.
I would say even one more thing is that the fact that it's even if it's an IP, by the fact that everything is already an IP, you go through satellite, but in parallel you can send it either through different lines and connectivity. So from that perspective, you are gaining much more than those X% of overhead. You have a flexibility of parallel transmission or storage or retransmission, which give you a lot of benefits.
Absolutely. Agreed. Any more comments or questions on that subject? So,
actually, I'm with the international fiber provider, so I appreciate your response there. And that was my question. When do you really consider When do you consider fiber optic transport versus satellite for IP-based content?
I guess I could start with that answer. I mean, obviously, the fiber optic transport ends up being more economical because you're not paying for a monthly satellite bandwidth fees. If you need to reach one-to-many, and those many are in rural areas that there's not fiber reaching, there's obviously a solution is satellite. But with that in mind, we could bring it to the others if you want to add your 2 cents. But
Well, I think it all depends on your network topology. In other words, how many sites you have and where they're located. Like Paul said, if you're talking about more of a point-to-point or a point to a few multi-points and they're located close to an MPLS node or close to a place where there's fiber already, then you know the economics, generally speaking, can tend to favor fiber optic. On the other hand, if you're like PBS and you're distributing to hundreds of stations around the country, their cost to put in MPLS nodes at all the stations and the monthly cost on that would far exceed what they're paying for the satellite. So it really all goes in where they're located and how many there are.
But then also, for us, the one-to-many, for the distribution, but also upstream of that, the many-to-one. We receive files via our ingest areas or our media operations center daily. But then also for live programming, we have ingest facilities at the operations where I am for those live-to-air programs. Those come to us via HDSDI 270s, but we're limited on that capacity as it relates to fiber because of the local carrier, the local provider. They're not willing to put in any more dark fiber because their model says, well, you have to pay for it in order to get it. Now, I understand, appreciate that, but as that end user who needs those ad hoc services, we're now looking at two different models. I've seen a 30 to 50% increase on my uplink downlink capacity for HD program delivery to us, and we're also looking for the video IP solution, to augment, the limited fiber capacity that we currently have. But all in all, like what we're suggesting is probably a wash. It's just what is, like the MPLS, what's available for content exactly. And his comment was location, location, location. And it is. That's exactly it.
And big difference between distribution and contribution. I mean, in the contribution network, we see more and more content being provided in IP. I mean, significantly more content in IP over fiber than IP over satellite. And numbers, what we have, if it is global distribution, actual numbers were from Democratic and Republican Convention, order of magnitude savings when it was IP over fiber.
Interesting.
No, that's an excellent point, George.
Paul, can I add one thing? Another factor is your incremental costs for adding new stations. I teach a course for the NAB Satellite Uplink Operator course, and a couple of courses back I had a guy from a local Washington, D.C. area church in the course. And I asked him, I said, you're in the Washington area and you've got maybe 4 satellite churches and they're all in the Washington area. Why are you using satellites? I mean, it would seem to me you could get their fiber a lot cheaper. He said, that's true. He said, but he said, every time I want to add someone, another church, or someone wants to get my pastor's sermons, the incremental cost is 0. So if you're in a growth mode and you're increasing, then you might want to take the satellite and use the satellite just because the incremental cost of adding one more receiver is just basically the cost of the dish and the receiver itself, which is pretty small.
That actually was IP Prime's model. I mean, they wanted to get all of the capital that they needed up front and try to dig up as many customers as possible, and that didn't happen. But obviously, their incremental cost would be 0. Customers would be paying for the dishes. So, with that in mind, then how can the content owners of today future-proof their investments? I mean, when we're talking about IP, we're really future-proofing. We're making an effective interface that could deal with whether it be voice, video, data, any type of content. So, what more can the content owners do to future-proof their investment to bring it to our children? Ultimately, what we're designing today is going to support what our children are using in the futures.
One word, IPification. Oh, one word, IPification.
Amplification.
Basically move to IP, end-to-end IP.
IPification.
From that perspective, I would say something a little bit different. I think we are talking about, yes, of course, IPification is a must on top of it, but you need, I guess, with the new technologies coming on, with different type of encoding mechanism, whether it is MPEG-2 or MPEG-4 or Adobe Flash and that kind of stuff, and YouTube and Hulu. I think from that perspective they should keep their, I would say, copies in different formats, different resolutions, so they can address a classical convergence world, so they can address various, I would say, screens, whether it's a television, PDA, mobile, and PC, but it's together, I would say. So it's content formatting, reformatting, and amplification together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to reinforce your point, I mean, what we going to coin the term MediaNet, and when we talk about MediaNet, it is IP enabled, but industrial strength end-to-end IP delivery, which is rich media ready. So I mean, you have to be network aware, you have to be content aware, you have to be endpoint aware. So that's probably exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
So where do we go from today? How do we IPificate the world? George?
I guess I'm going to travel more and produce more case studies. And I mean, as I said, we're using NBC, all the top tier European and US broadcasters.
Well, I think it's happening naturally. I was looking at some microwave equipment for a customer on the floor the other day, and stopped by the booth, and the guy said, well, do you have this interface or that interface? And he says, or you could just have an IP interface. And so you don't need it. If you don't have a DS3 interface, just IP, put your video in IP, and we'll interface with it at that level. The availability of distribution systems that handle IP are really converting systems to IP even before they ordinarily would. For example, if you want to buy even a network, a fiber optic network today, you might be buying gigabit Ethernet. Because the gigabit Ethernet offerings that are being made not only by the telephone companies but the cable companies are very cost competitive. Well, you're going to have to take your video and put it into IP to get it onto the gigabit Ethernet. And people are doing that, and they're, even cross country you'll see large gig-E networks, multi-users. So I think from not only from the standpoint that you want to have IP video so that you can see it on your PC and your consumer device, but also the distribution systems are becoming so facile when it comes to handling IP files that it's happening automatically.
Ovadio O'Brien, anything to add?
Although we see the convergence, I think there is a long way to go with consumers really, I would say, having this experience of viewing the same content on different devices. But, it's part of market education, pure marketing, and pushing this into the market. The infrastructure, I would say, the technology is there, and now we need to have the consumers with us. At the end of the day, they are paying our bill.
Absolutely.
Education.
Education, IPification. Any other questions from the audience? Come on, don't be shy. Okay. Go ahead.
Again, just curious if your supplier or vendor partners have been proactive in helping you move to IP, lessen the terror video circuit world, and if they have, who are they?
For us, we have set entities within our infrastructure that will deliver us programming. And I'm talking near live or live programming. And they have to follow our QA/QC or our SOP standards in a book, basically a red book, but just a little more advanced. So with that being said, we have stringent guidelines on how to receive said program. It is getting increasingly difficult, to open that up. Let's say an S&G operator. If they're going to send me an event or a program, if it's near live, in other words, I'm able to get it in the can and then play it out 30 minutes later, then you don't have to provide me a backup. If it's live at time of air, and this is standard broadcast industry standard, so just very much a basic SOP, but when you talk about monetary obligations, they're very hesitant to provide that second backup. And if we're doing an HD program and it's a full slice on a bird, you can easily provide me with an anamorphic feed on a terrestrial fiber. So it's trying to, and I'm not sure if I answered specifically, but again, it's location, location, location. In addition to, those providers that actually are within our system to provide said program, we know that works, but then also testing and QA and qualifying those additional ad hoc or one-offs outside of the network. And when I say the network, I'm talking about our infrastructure.
Circuit switch to moving to an IP infrastructure as opposed to the legacy 270s?
It's a push and pull, and it's based on their business model. They're not going to install dark fiber unless I have a need for it. But because I have used every available strand that is coming to me, the next tier would then be, at least a 7 or a 9 strand, and it's got to be a single hop and not multiple hops for fear that at one of those COs we're going to be popped off the air. So I can say it's a push-pull. It hasn't been a great relationship, but when I'm protecting my network and my air, that comes first. So I will do any and everything possible in order to ensure that on-air reliability for my 300-plus stations across the CONUS.
Thank you, O'Brien. If there are any other things to add to the question, otherwise I would want to throw out there also with respect to the suppliers and with respect to where the world is going within GSI. And again, I'm not trying to make this a sales pitch, but within GSI, we have our broadcast expert teams, we have our networking and IP expert teams, and proof positive that really the world is driving to IP is all of the suppliers that come to us, because we have labs for each of those expert teams, and the suppliers generally bring us the alpha and beta models of their products and ask us to beat the crap out of them and show them what is needed, what's needed to be added to them to make them a more successful product. But certainly it shows the world is trying to ipificate, if you will, and we're seeing it every day at Globecomm, and I'm sure the gentlemen here are seeing it every day. But I'd like to take this time to thank you, gentlemen. If there are no other questions, thanks for joining us today. We appreciate your attendance, and again, wanted to mention that this... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Paul, a Globecomm question. You're repositioning your company to look more like a total solutions provider than a satellite company.
That's correct.
Where do we draw the line as a small business in terms of providing content through a Showtime or having an independent IPTV network, is there a dollar line that we should look at as a small business to where we can provide it or have to go to a tier 2 or tier 3 provider?
Well, whether it be hosted or not, really
Yes.
coming to. Actually, you draw the line in your business plan. Your business plan should show you that you could afford so much capital expense, but along with that capital expense, you're going to have to deal with things like O'Brien deals with. You're going to have operators that you're paying a salary, and you're going to have the real estate to support that capital. Also, you're going to have the expenses of the operational expenses along with the same lines. So, do you want to develop your business case based on all of those expenses and how your system would grow, or do you want to come to a Globecomm where we could host everything you do and you just have to get your customers? That's really and you'll pay a monthly fee to Globecomm, such as leasing a car. So that's really the difference. So is there an actual dollar fee? I can say no. There isn't a dollar fee. It's all in your business plan. What type of customer base you expect to achieve, and what expenses you can handle.
Service provider versus capital equipment expenditure.
Absolutely. And we've noticed that as our customers have grown bigger, they've gotten to the point, as our service customers have grown bigger, that we've hosted their services, they've gotten to the point where they've said, okay, we're paying you so much per month. We've gotten to the point where we've grown our business immensely, and we'd like you to transition us, build the network for us. That way you don't have to host it anymore at your facility. And there's always a break-even point and a return on investment point where the customer realizes that. Absolutely. Thanks for asking. You allowed me to give more of a sales pitch. Anyway, if there are no other questions, I'd like to adjourn and thank everybody for coming here and mention the sponsors, Intelsat, Inmarsat, Marlboro Systems, and of course Cisco. The next forum or the next session will be, I have it at 3 o'clock. Okay, the next session will be 2:40. Is that finding distribution model? Finding the distribution model for mobile video. So a lot of you might be interested in that. Thank you for joining us.